Good. Okay, there we are. Good afternoon to everyone.
Good afternoon.
So we are reaching one of the great peaks of Torah. We are reaching the peak of Mount Sinai, which, yes, in the grand scope of mountains, is not considered to be the mightiest. But what's happening here is a significant event, I guess you might call that. Well, what happens at Mount Sinai? Revelation, 10 Commandments. Theophany, the hearing of God. God appears. And what does that mean? What does that look like? Right? You're a director of a movie. And your name is not Cecil B. DeMille. Or maybe it is. I don't know. How do you stage this? Right? So you need a mountain.
Yeah.
Good. We got a mountain. Mount Sinai does not look like that, but that's the only mountain I can draw. You need a mountain. Now what happens?
A lot of little people.
All right. So you need a bunch of people. Okay. I'm assuming that we're putting them at the base of the mountain. Maybe that's presumptuous of me, but we're going to see that they're definitely not going up the mountain.
We know they have to start at the base of the mountain at any rate.
Okay. So we got a bunch of people around the mountain. Good.
I might have lightning.
Lightning.
Clouds.
Right. I have lightning. And
Thunder.
Lightning. Right. And,
We all saw the movie.
okay.
Yeah, right.
Well, if God is talking, there's got to be something going on.
Well, no, the
Inside.
text says it's.
Oh, I'm not even the text. I'm a
You're not in the table. Oh, okay. Wait a minute.
Imagine.
So you're saying you can just imagine what this was like?
I would have to imagine if God were appearing, it would not be so quiet. Hi, guys. It would be major.
And yet, when God is talking to Elijah, and we hear Kol Demamah Daka, the still small voice.
Well, that's after
That's
all of the
different.
noise.
Oh, that's after all of the noise. Okay. Okay.
Well, if you're going to talk
Where's
to 800,000 people at
where's
one time,
where's Mr. Moses?
where's Moses?
Say that number again
He's
and
with the
realize how.
All right, so
Are we talking first instance?
800,000 people.
there is only one instance
No, I mean.
of revelation,
Yeah.
right?
Well.
And then what happens? All right, we got the stage set, we've got the special effects going on the green screen in the background.
Right.
And then what happens?
Oh,
The people hear the God.
Okay.
And they are panic stricken.
What do you mean?
And
What,
they-
wait. What do you mean they heard God?
here.
They hear God
They hear-
getting up from his chair?
No, they
They-
hear
they-
the commandments.
They hear, wait.
No,
They hear
No.
the commandments.
no.
Which, all 613?
No, 10, no.
All 10?
That's,
Is it
the
one?
way.
Or is it one? What do they hear?
What do they? Yeah, interesting.
Right, so what do they
the
hear?
lightning.
Right, that
I've got to have a voice.
that is our question. What do they hear? Right, and
We know they have to hear the first.
do we?
Yes,
No.
because they get in trouble.
No, they got scared. They didn't
No,
want to
she's
hear
saying-
anything.
Yeah.
Because they get blamed for the golden calf, you have to hold them accountable for the golden calf only because they heard it. So that's an argument by logic, but not necessarily an argument from the text.
Ah, wait, right.
Okay, well, we're going to read the text together, so you don't need to flip too many pages yet. But my point is, this is considered to be the peak of our experience, the foundational event of our nation, and yet
We don't know how.
we have no idea what's actually happened. Right? All we know is that it was a big deal, and we know that at the other end of it, we were connected to God and we were doing this Torah thing. But the actual event, the actual Mount Sinai, I wouldn't trust any of you to direct the movie,
No, huh?
because you're not giving me a clear description of what's actually happening.
Well, some of what we think we know is definitely affected by the movie.
Yes.
Yes, definitely.
Once you've seen the movie, it's hard to go back to the book without bringing those images, and that may be a problem. One of my biggest gripes about that movie in particular is the fact that the theophany that is portrayed in Cecil B. DeMille's 10 Commandments is completely and utterly private between God and Moses. Right, Moses is up on the rocks, and he's like standing here, and there's the thou shalt da 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 da, and this lightning comes down and blasts into the rock, and then blasts the next one in the rock, and Moses is cowering there, and there's not another person within miles. We're going to see that is definitely not how the text portrays it and how our tradition understands it. But what these people in particular are experiencing is going to be our big question.
They say,
Who they?
the people, when they, at the moment,
At a moment.
that they are terrified.
Hmm.
And they make the statement, Naseh Nishma, we will do,
Right?
and we will
Sorry,
hear.
I'm just checking to make sure that there's a problem with it.
Right.
Oh,
Oh, there is.
Penelope says, are you started? It's just the loading wheel of doom.
Oh, that rounds, oh, it's going.
All right, let's see if we can't figure this out here. It says it's going. Hold on a second. You gotta love technology. Let's see what we got here. That's all correct. What's that?
What's going?
There's so many trips up and down that mountain.
There's so many things here to make it work.
It's talk amongst yourselves. I'll be back in a minute.
Right. Wow.
How many trips up and down?
Well,
Two?
no, actually, there's like 3 or 4 or something.
Who?
Moses keeps going up, and then he comes down, and then he
And
goes back
sometimes
up
he
again.
goes with Aaron and
And
sometimes
sometimes he goes in
without
Joshua.
Come on.
Aaron. At least once there's a whole bunch of other elders.
Yeah. It's like,
Is he always going up and down? We have that.
Who's going up? Who's coming down, right?
Or is he just hearing that eventually as things go along, just talking to him? Just like God's been talking to him to get people out of Egypt. We didn't have Moses didn't have to go up any mountain. Get the people out of Egypt. Tell Pharaoh, talk to Pharaoh. You didn't have to go up a mountain. You just learn him, like face to face. I mean, what do you need?
All right, so we'd like to try and get this to work because I've had a lot of people ask me about this question, so.
remember that this particular group of people, who I personally would have left them in the desert a long time ago.
I'd leave all our Jews in the desert right now. You're kidding? You can't agree on anything.
All right.
Too high check for me.
It works every week though. That's good. Are the plugs all in?
Everything is in,
Plugs are pushed.
but we are trying a backup, and if it works, it works. If it doesn't, technology is a nuisance. Okay, so let's bring us back to topic. We had a nice momentum there too, and we lost it. Technology, thank you for all you do, and curse you for all you do. But we are trying to figure out what actually happened at Mount Sinai. What was actually done, what was actually heard, what was actually experienced by the people there, or at least how our commentators have tried to understand what our text records of that. And to do that, of course, we need to see how the text records what is there. So we can't read all of the parasha today because we definitely wouldn't have time in discussing it. So go to page 439. This is chapter 19 of the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. And we're going to start on verse 16. All right, so we're on page 439, chapter 19, verse 16. How we doing? Everyone there?
Yes.
Okay. I can see we have a volunteer that's eager to go. Yes?
Yeah,
You ready to play God?
I am ready. Oh, I don't know about that far.
It's a big role. It's a big role. Who played God in Ten Commandments?
Seems to be the mill.
Really?
That was
His own. He
That
was.
his own voice.
Oh, well, you know,
Yeah.
the shoe fits. A bit of typecasting, I think, there, but
He wasn't gonna get that work anybody else.
yeah. All right.
On the third day, as morning dawned, there was thunder and lightning and a dense cloud upon the mountain and a very loud blast of the horn, and all the people who were in the camp trembled. Moses led the people out of the camp toward God, and they took their places at the foot of the mountain.
All right. So far, sounds like what we had here, right? We got a mountain, people at the base, clouds, thunder. It's a pretty awesome experience. Good.
Now, Mount Sinai was all in smoke, for the Lord had come down upon it in fire. The smoke rose like the smoke of a kiln, and the whole mountain trembled violently. The blare of the horn grew louder and louder. As Moses spoke, God answered him in thunder. The Lord came down upon Mount Sinai on the top of the mountain, and the Lord called Moses to the top of the mountain, and Moses went up. The Lord said to Moses, "Go down, warn the people not to break through to the Lord to gaze, lest many of them perish. The priests also who come near the Lord must stay pure, lest the Lord break out against them. But Moses said to the Lord, the people cannot come up to Mount Sinai, for you warned us, saying, set bounds about the mountain and sanctify it. So the Lord said to him, go down and come back together with Aaron, but let not the priests or the people break through to come up to the Lord, lest he break out against them. And Moses went down to the people and spoke to them.
All right, clear?
No, nothing much.
Yeah, term one is instructions.
Okay, so it's a little confusing, but the basic idea is that Moses goes up, gets a clear understanding of what God wants, comes back down, and the people are now fully prepared. Right? They are ready for the experience that is about to happen. Amidst all of the loud noise and thunder and shaking of a mountain.
So Moses is 80 plus years old,
Mm-hmm.
and he has to climb a shaking mountain.
Sort of sounds like
But
a
80 then, was
Yeah.
not 80 now.
Yeah. Well, what's your point? But
Couldn't God have simply said, don't come near the mountain?
good, and had, as a matter of fact, which Moses is reminding that he remembered this.
Hey, remember you told us this already.
Okay.
So why does he have to talk again? This is the issue of why only the revelation to one person.
Okay. Moses is occupying a rather special place here.
Mhm.
Right? Think about that for a moment. God is preparing to give the Decalogue, to give the Seret HaDibrot, the 10 utterances, what we often call the 10 Commandments, to the nation, or something. Maybe I'm jumping the gun, at least of what we generally refer to this as. And Moses is kind of acting as a go-between already from the start. I mean, can't the people on the mountain, at the base of the mountain, hear God tell Moses, come up so I can tell you something, and then go back and then get them ready? I mean, if I'm standing here and someone calls the person next to me, aren't I going to hear it? So haven't the people already begun to hear God before they get to hear God?
But this sounds like a volcano going. I mean, things are trembling and the power's coming. And Moses, on this volcano, he's actually walking up the mountain. This is awesome. At least when
Absolutely.
if he ever comes down from there, of course we're going to have to listen to him because how can anybody do this?
So what you're saying is
But
that
Aaron goes with him.
Aaron goes in the
Second time.
the
And
second
that's
second
second
lap,
time.
right? But hold on a second. The way you describe this is like a volcanic eruption. The sound from Krakatoa, which is one of the most famous volcanic eruptions of all time, could be heard thousands of miles away. Is that really the best time to give a speech?
To get your attention.
Well, it gets your attention, but can you hear me over the sound of the mountain exploding? There's a giant rising horn blast that's going throughout everything. There's thunder and lightning everywhere.
They have their attention.
And then God's going to talk over the top of that?
Everything
Goes
goes
into
into
Moses, I said, God's about to tell you. No, I said, people, God, can you hold it down? I'm trying to tell them what you're about to do. Moses is trying to tell them instructions on top of all of this? Hello?
Are you okay?
We're okay.
Well, God's been talking to us. I assure.
I'm just trying to make a point. Just trying to make a point.
experiencing Mount Sinai.
Somebody who's misbehaving.
Exactly. You should see what it's like when I actually shout. Okay. So this is a rather odd setup for a big speech. And it's a rather odd setup with, I want to talk to them, so I'm going to talk to you first while you're among them, so that you can tell them I'm about to talk to them. Oh, wait, are they listening or are they not listening to me talk to you about talking to them? It's odd, right? And that's one of the reasons why you all had such difficulty coming up with a good staging for what you would do if you were the movie director. And it may be one of the reasons why Cecil B. DeMille did what he did when he actually did stage this. But let's see, what is God actually going to say, right? Because God is now speaking to them, right? Or is he? Right? Well, what was our last sentence?
Moses went down to the people and spoke to them.
And then what's our first sentence of chapter 20?
God spoke all these words.
saying.
Saying.
Okay, so who is saying that?
Which,
Right, we
this,
don't know.
This first verse of chapter 20.
Is this Moses reporting what God said to him, or is this God actually talking?
That's the question, right? Let's make sure everyone understands that. The last verse of chapter 19 said, and Moses went down to the people and spoke to them. And the first verse of chapter 20 is, God spoke all these words saying. Is that Moses reporting a speech that God gave him to deliver? Or did Moses, in that last verse of chapter 19, give the instructions about stay here, be good, don't break through, and all of that? And then chapter 20 begins, which is a whole new speech given by God directly to everyone.
I go with two.
Well, we like number 2. It sounds better, right? But it's
This
not.
is the narrator.
It's not explicitly clear. Well, okay, so let's go ahead and work our way through the 10.
So God spoke all these words, saying, I, the Lord, am your God, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, the house of bondage. You shall have no other gods besides me. You shall not make for yourself a sculptured image or any likeness of what is in the heavens above, or on the earth below, or in the waters under the earth. You shall not bow down to them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am an impassioned God, visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the third and upon the fourth generation of those who reject me, but showing kindness to the 1,000th generation of those who love me and keep my commandments. You shall not swear falsely by the name of the Lord your God, for the Lord will not clear one who swears falsely by his name. Remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the 7th day is a Sabbath of the Lord your God. You shall not do any work. You, your son or daughter, your male or female slave, or your cattle, or the stranger who is within your settlements. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea and all that is in them, and he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath and hallowed it. Honor your father and your mother, that you may long endure on the land that the Lord your God is assigning to you.
That's the first 5. All right, we've just finished the first 5 of the Aseret HaDibra. Any brief questions? We're not really going to go into too many details of the commandments themselves. That's for other classes. We've gone through in previous classes the breakdown of how we number the commandments, of what is number 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. But we're not going to go into too much detail, but I do want to give a little bit of chance for questions if there are.
just real quick, did any other cultures have the Sabbath?
There were other ideas of breaks and cessation. From what I understand, they did not have the same flavor.
Or even the concept of a day off?
Days off, but not weekly. So there were definitely times in festivals and holidays when people would stop their work. But the idea that this would happen on every 7th day, an actual weekly basis, did not exist.
Okay, so we invented it.
We certainly invented the frequency. We didn't invent the idea of not working, but we definitely invented the idea that this would happen with this regularity.
The one that continues to bother me.
Mm-hmm.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay, that's what I was going to.
Okay.
Visiting the guilt of the parents upon the children, upon the 3rd and 4th generation.
You know, it's,
Yeah.
but it's funny. Hold on a second. I just want to point out, I have never in all of my years of being a rabbi, coming up to a recent number now, had anyone ask me about the second half of that.
Oh, about blessing them to the
About showing
1,000th
kindness to 1,000
kindness.
generations. Everyone gets up in arms. How can God be willing to punish someone 3rd or 4th generation for what their parents did? And no one says, how can God be so unfair as to reward someone just because their 1,000th generation ago ancestor did something good? No one gets upset about the second one.
I am.
But I've seen that very logically. That is, if you have, for example, parents who are alcoholics, your childhood is going to be a mess. And what happens to those kids is they don't raise their children right either. It's practically speaking, that is what happens. Whereas parents who are wonderful and good and show their children love, their children know how to behave to their children. And so that carries through generations
right.
as well.
So there are,
That's
hold on.
Normally.
Right.
Yes.
So
But
there are,
there are wonderful parents who,
Once
for
in a while.
some reason or other, have miserable criminal children.
which, by the way, are among our own ancestors as recorded. That is to say, if you look back at King David, generally considered to be a very good guy, you look at a lot of his kids and his grandkids and great-grandkids and so on, and you get a lot of dread. So there's a couple of the traditional answers that I can give in short form, but we definitely will want to talk about this in more
Well, they
length.
whitewash it by saying in judicial law it never happened.
Oh, no. Well, first of all, that's not whitewashing. It is true. That is to say that this is not something that was ever adjudicated on.
That's right.
That is to say, the child of a parent, if let's say a man was a murderer, you don't take and execute the son for the father's crime. That's not whitewashing. That is literally true.
Right.
But that the commandment itself doesn't claim that the judicial should. The commandment says God keeps track of these things. And the traditional explanations basically fall into two types of explanations. One is somewhat what Harriet is saying, which is this is a practical description, not necessarily an imposed external punishment. That is to say, those that do wrong reap the benefits, and the benefits will often accrue to their children. Right? If you've lived a life of crime, your children will be among those who are most affected by it, and they will be affected disproportionately the longer that goes on. So that's one category of answers. And then they get into more detail. The other category of answers is that if you read it in a particular way, and you can call it whitewashing if you like, I think it is a fairly compelling read. The idea being that there is an accrual of guilt if the children continue to draw from the same checking account. That is to say, there is interest on crime, and if a child continues to work and walk in the ways of the parent, that is to say, if you are the murderer, son of a murderer, son of a murderer.
There are crime families, we all know that.
Correct.
We accept that as a fact.
Well, but the idea that is saying here is that if you choose to continue in those ways, then your punishment spiritually, not in terms of the human court, but your spiritual punishment will be the cumulative effect of the punishment from the previous generations as well. And that again is something that you don't have to be stuck with. If you turn from what your parents were doing, if your parents were murderers, and you choose not to be a murderer, then you are no longer drawing on their bank account. You're no longer paying their debts.
It doesn't say that, Kelly.
It does, depending upon how you read it, right? And it has to do with how you define what does it mean to be, the children of these people, of multiple generations.
Those who reject me, if
Exactly.
the children do not reject me,
Exactly.
then they're going to be fine.
Exactly. It's possible for the children to break the cycle. And by the way, it's also possible for children to break the cycle of good. That is to say that if a child of a righteous person breaks the cycle and becomes a horrible person, they can't expect to go back and get the bank account from their righteous parents and cash those checks. So that there is an idea here that there is a cumulative effect, both for good and bad, if the children choose to continue to go good or bad. But each generation does have their own choice, and each generation ultimately will make their own destiny. So that's the short answer. There's much more to be said about it, but that is the short answer. Okay, last five on page 447, verse 13.
You shall not murder. You shall not commit adultery. You shall not steal. You shall not bear false witness against your neighbor. You shall not covet your neighbor's house. You shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male or female slave, or his ox, or his ass, or anything that is your neighbor's.
All right, the last five go a lot faster.
Yeah.
That's the end of the 10. And then we get the final response.
All the people witnessed the thunder and lightning, the blare of the horn, and the mountains smoking. And when the people saw it, they fell back and stood at a distance. You speak to us, they said to Moses, and we will obey. But let not God speak to us, lest we die. Moses answered the people, be not afraid, for God has come only in order to test you, and in order that the fear of him may be ever with you, so that you do not go astray. So the people remained at a distance, while Moses approached the thick cloud where God was.
All right. So who experienced this?
Everybody.
Did they?
Didn't they? Well, they're scared. They
But
saw
what
something.
are they scared about?
That's right. The thunder and lightning.
The thunder, the lightning, the blare of the horn, the mountain smoking, and they stood back and for a distance.
Yeah.
It doesn't say they were afraid because they heard God.
No. Right.
It says they were afraid because they saw the mountain. And they say, you go talk to God. But didn't God just talk?
Oh, who heard it?
Okay. Confusing. Yes?
Yes.
Good. As I always say, if you're confused, it means you're ready to learn. I have deep suspicion of people who aren't confused. What's that?
But the sentence, but let not God speak to us, lest we die.
Exactly. This whole experience is so overpowering and awesome that they basically feel if I get any more of this, it's going to literally blow my mind, and I will expire. This was what I explained in my Understanding God YouTube series. It's like trying to drink from the fire hose. It's just a little overwhelming, to say the least. All right, so we're going to look at a couple of different traditions, and you will find they disagree. So the fact that there's not unanimity should not be surprising, but the fact that we couldn't come up with a clear and unambiguous and unanimous description also means we're just in good company. Okay, so let's go ahead and start with Rambam, who makes things clearer about why this is important.
Moses said to the Israelites, "Do not fear. The purpose of this great sight is that you should see the truth with your own eyes. When the Lord your God will test you by a false prophet."
Pause there for a second.
Oh.
This is hearkening back to those last few lines about the idea that God is testing you. Well, what's the test by this Mount Sinai experience? And Rambam is saying the test is that you will then be able to test prophets that come in the future. Because what are you going to be holding them up to? What's your gold standard going to be?
When the Lord your God will test you by a false prophet who will tell you the reverse of what you heard, you will remain firm and your steps will not slide. If I had come as a messenger as you desired and had told you that which had been said unto me and which you had not heard, you would perhaps consider as true what another might tell you in opposition to that which you heard from me. But it is different now, as you have heard it in the midst of the great sight.
All right, so what's Rambam's point about why this is happening and the fact that the people are going to put aside the word here for a moment, they are definitely experiencing God at this moment, right? He's saying very clearly, the people experienced God in some way, shape, or form, and we'll get into that in more detail, but that experience by the people is important. Why?
Well, it's not like if I just walked into this room and said, guys, I just spoke to God outside, and here's what he said you have to do. You'd look at me and say, you what?
Well, but they're more, Moses, according to Rambam, is more worried about the secondary, which is, I do believe you. You know what?
Right.
What you told me about that happened to you over in that mountain, I think that is the most amazing and believable thing ever. Where can I sign up for your product? Right? Where can I follow you?
Oh, okay.
And then long after you die, someone else comes up and says, I was on the top of another mountain. And we say, you know what? That sounds really good too. Where can I sign up for your product? If it's a completely private experience by these prophets or people who purport to be prophets, then I have no way as the common Joe or common Jew to distinguish between one version and another version. And I'm just following upon my ability to trust the person, not because of my belief in the event and the reality that's behind it.
But we can listen to prophets as long as they don't say anything against what Moses said.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that becomes very important in the book of Deuteronomy, where it's all spelled out very clearly. What is a prophet you should believe and what is a prophet you shouldn't believe. And what he's saying here is that you still need to believe that the gold standard for prophecy is somebody who speaks on this way, and I have to start it right, where you all have a taste of that experience too. Taste, we're going to get more detail of, but there has to be some buy-in and some understanding that experiencing God is not something that happens to other people who come back and bring you the footnotes, or not the footnotes, the cliff notes. For those of you that remember what cliff notes were, the abridged version. You need to understand that experiencing God is your job too. And you may not be a prophet, you may not get it exactly the way I'm going to get it. Rambam's going to make that really clear. But you have to have some, what's the word they use nowadays? Skin in the game. That's the phrase that the politicians throw around too much. You got to have some skin in the game, so that way when some other guy shows up and starts doing his story, it won't ring true, and you're not going to go wandering after the latest storyteller. right? If you've experienced it, you're anchored. Make sense?
Yeah.
Maybe? Okay. So let's see what actually was going on.
The children of Israel did not believe in Moses because of the signs he presented. For someone who believes because of the signs he presents is tainted, for they may be spells and witchcraft.
All right, make sure we understand that. He's saying the people didn't trust Moses just because he did fancy miracles. It's like, wow, anybody who can part the sea, okay, whatever you tell me to do about my marriage and my family and my crops and our criminal laws, I'll buy that too. He's saying, no, that's not why the people believed in Moses. Not just because he was parting sea and turning the blood and all that kind of stuff.
Turning a rod into a snake or
that did not convince us to follow him as lawgiver.
The signs that Moses performed in the wilderness were done for the needs of the moment and not to bring proof of his prophecies. There was a need to sink the Egyptians, provide food and water, destroy Korach, etc.
And so miracles were done for those things, right? We had to get across the ocean, so the ocean was split. We had to eat, so we got manna. We had to drink, so we hit the rock and we got water. He wasn't doing that to prove what a great lawgiver he was. He was doing that so we could actually meet the needs of the moment.
They were really a stiff-necked people.
But what's great here is what Rambam is flipping on our head is that most of us would think, well, if someone did a miracle like that, then I would believe anything else they said. And he said, no, you shouldn't. Right? Just because someone does something fancy doesn't mean you believe anything else they say. It means you appreciate what happened right there if it was a need of the moment, but that does not give you any credit for when you go on to say things that may be dubious.
It was Mount Sinai that made them believe in Moses, when our eyes and no one else's saw, and our ears and no one else's heard. And Moses drew near to the darkness, and the voice spoke to him, and we heard it saying to Moses, 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 go tell them such and such. From where is it known that the assembly at Mount Sinai was the proof that the prophecy of Moses was true and that he was not speaking basely? It is derived from the verse, lo, I come to you in a thick cloud, that the people may hear when I speak with you and believe you forever. From this we see that prior to the assembly at Mount Sinai, their belief in Moses was not one that would have lasted forever, but it was a belief that left room for discussion and thought.
Like, well, maybe. No, when we were at Sinai and we experienced God talking to Moses, we believed Moses. Think about that for a second. What Rambam is saying here is that we believed Moses after we heard God talking to Moses. It's not that we didn't believe in God. Maybe we did, maybe we didn't. That's another secondary issue. But that the act of Sinai was important not just to get us to believe in God, not just to give us Torah, but to give us confidence that what Moses was teaching us was in fact what God wanted us to know, which is underlying proof for the rest of the Torah. And so this is really a very alternate way of looking at why Mount Sinai was important. Because one of the questions that a lot of people ask is, well, how much actually did we hear and how much came? And if the only thing we learned at Mount Sinai were the things we heard at Mount Sinai, that could leave an awful lot of the Torah as a big question mark. Right? Are we going to say the only stuff that we believe in is the stuff that we all heard? Then, as we're going to see, we may have only heard 10 things, or we may have only heard 2 things. Does that mean the rest of the Torah we're not going to believe in? What Rambam is saying is no, we believe in what we heard, and we believed that God was talking to Moses because we heard that exchange. That whole thing that I was joking about, well, can't they hear that God's talking to Moses and saying do this and do that? And that was important. That wasn't just a confusing little aside that happened and it made it look weird. That was part of the point of bringing us to Mount Sinai. The point of Mount Sinai wasn't just to give us the 10 commandments, but also to give us faith in Moses so that as he continued to lead us and teach us for the next 40 years, we would still believe him, rather than just saying, he's probably making it up. No, we actually saw God talking to him. I think I'm going to buy him. I'm going to believe what he's talking about. Right? So it's not just a confusing exchange. It was deliberately done in front. It was a staged effect to make sure the people would believe Moses from then on out. Make sense? Maybe? Okay. But now let's get to what did we actually hear. We've got Rambam saying, at least we heard God going, Moses, and that was, okay, yeah, this is really happening. But how much of the 10 Commandments of this did we actually hear? Talmud.
There are 613 commandments.
Famously stated here in the Talmud.
Said Rav Hamnuna, what verse of scripture indicates that fact?
Now, notice for a second, there is never in any part of the Talmud or in early rabbinic literature an official list of the 613. There is a proof that there are 613 commandments because there is a verse that he is going to use to prove it, not because he is going to give you the list. It was left to later scholars to try and come up with the list. And they disagreed, not substantially, but on a few minor points here and there and a few major ones about what counts as a commandment and what doesn't. But they're aiming for this number of 613 because of this proof text.
Moses commanded us Torah, an inheritance of the congregation of Jacob, and that's in Deuteronomy. The gematria of the word Torah is 611, not counting I am and you shall have no other gods, since these have come to us from the mouth of the Almighty.
All right, so Torah, 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 Tziva lanu Moshe. That's the verse that he's quoting, right? The one that we sing every time we are putting away the Torah. That's the Moses commanded us Torah, an inheritance of the congregation of Yaakov. Right, that's the song. This is what it means, he's saying. The word Torah, if you do the gematria, you do the math for the numbers, adds up to 611. Moses commanded us Torah. Moses commanded us 611. Well, wait a minute. 611 ain't 613. Where do the other two come in? I am, and you shall have no other gods. But if Moses didn't command us those, who did? Directly from God. Right? So what Rav Hamnuna is saying here is that we take this verse literally, that the word Torah doesn't just mean Torah. The word Torah here is actually just a number, and it means Moses commanded us 611. And the other two, right? So these are Moses's commandments. That is to say, the ones that were communicated to us through the intermediary of Moses. And these we got directly from God, which gives us 613, and which means at Mount Sinai, how many did we hear? How many did we hear? Two, right? So Rav Hamnuna is saying the theophany, the Sisa B'Demil moment, the smoking mountain, the fire and the thunder that everybody's involved in, and God going, we only heard the first two commandments. And the rest of it were not communicated to us directly. The rest of us were communicated through Moses to us. Good, bad, indifferent? Not buying the logic?
Different from some of the others.
What's that?
A little different from some of the other ideas.
A little different, right? Most of us, we were sort of going, okay, we either have Moses doing it all, or we've got 613 or at least 10 all happening at once. Yeah, it's not exactly satisfying, right? Because we're splitting up the commandments.
But it still proves, when I said that everyone heard those first two.
Everyone heard something.
Okay, heard
Right.
something. Let's say the first two. Therefore, when Moses goes back to the mountain and he's gone for 40 days and they make the golden calf.
You're still happy because they're on the hook.
They're on the hook.
They're on the hook for the golden calf because they definitely heard no other gods. Although I should point out the no other gods, they didn't consider the golden calf to be another god. They believed that was a statue of their god. That was a statue of Adonai. They never claimed this was another god by another name. So they were just improperly worshiping God. They weren't actually rejecting God.
Still, why a cow?
It was still why a
Golden mountain.
why not a golden mountain? Exactly, yeah. You'd think a mountain would be easier to cast. Even I could, make a little clay mountain.
Well, I've heard when people, we talk about idol worshipers, and the idol that they have in front of them, they don't really think that's the God. That represents their God. They're not praying to that clay piece. It's a representation.
Yeah,
So this was a representation. is
It
what you're
depends.
saying.
We'll talk about the
Sure.
golden calf another time.
Right.
But there's another question that's all in here that most of you are, I don't think, are of the philosophical illness. I mean, the
Yeah.
philosophical style of thinking to brought up, which is God's making sound waves. How is God talking? I'm talking because I have a voice box and a tongue and a mouth and lungs. How is God talking? Does God have those parts? Let me ask that question again. Does God have parts?
Yeah.
No.
No. God, we do not believe that God has a body. Therefore, what is speaking to us? Not what meaning who, but what meaning what physical manifestation is occurring. And that's going to be Ibn Ezra's question.
How could an immaterial God create the physical phenomenon of a voice? Some say that God's word pre-existed the world.
Right. So this is basically the idea that God created what would be heard before creation began. And that sound has been vibrating around the universe until just this moment when it came out and hit the land at the moment and was heard. Right, so that way it puts this as a non-extra creation activity. This is all part of the initial creation. From the Big Bang till here, God's voice is echoing for 14 billion years. Which if anyone's voice could echo that long, it's okay to, I mean, but the idea is that this is built into creation. It is not it's not added to creation.
The sages of the Gaonic period say that God created a voice for this situation. Others say that since God's speech was miraculous, we cannot understand how it operated, as when he said, remember and observe. Right? It's said in one utterance, and we also have that mystery between the first set of 10 commandments and the second set of 10 commandments. It says, remember and observe Shabbat. And the answer the rabbis gave was he said both those words simultaneously. How can that happen? I don't know. But however that happened, maybe that's how this happened. Meaning we can't understand how God spoke. It's just a miracle, right? And you'll hear people say, you just have to have faith. It's just a miracle, right? Even Ezra's not going down that road. But the listeners were humans who heard the voice with their ordinary senses.
So he's going, wait a minute. Saying it's just a miracle is fine and dandy to explain how God did it, but that doesn't explain how we heard it, because that's its own problem.
Now, hearing is not sight, for the eye can receive many impressions at once. Since sound is a vibration in the air, it reaches the air in sequence, the first sound first and the last sound last.
Right, so yay for science in the medieval world,
Yeah.
right? You can tell that there's a difference. Light is hitting my eye all at once. The whole field of vision comes in simultaneously. Sound, if two sounds compete for my ear at the same time, I don't hear either of them. I just hear noise, right? And if I'm going to hear things simultaneously, it's a jumble. It has to be in sequence for me to hear it. And when it's a sequence, there is a definite order. So how could this possibly have worked, right? Because there is an idea that we heard all of the 10 commandments in one utterance. And he's saying that's fine. Yes, God, we can say miraculously can do that. But how can I can miraculously hear it?
If God is God,
Right.
then why couldn't people just have heard automatically everything implanted in their heads?
You mean why need
By
sound
God.
waves at all? Why need sound? But she's saying here in quotes, why do we even need sound waves?
The
Right.
thoughts of what were said
Mhm.
were just implanted automatically in their memory bank.
Right. So sound waves are a physical representation of words, and words are a concept or an idea. So why do you need that intermediate step of sound waves? Why not just beam it into your brain?
Exactly.
If we're going down the miracle road, just can't God make it appear in your mind without all of the sound wave nonsense in the meantime that's causing all this trouble? Hold on to that thought. Okay, we are going to get an opinion that says almost exactly that. But Ibn Ezra is basically trying to rule out this, I can solve any question I come by just saying it's a miracle and you have to believe. And he's basically saying that is not the road we go down. We don't just say, it's a miracle. And if that creates a problem, oh, another miracle must have fixed that problem. If that creates a problem, another miracle must have done. You don't just say, have faith, have faith, have faith. It's a miracle, miracle, miracle. It's okay. That's not how we approach Torah.
If one wishes to assert that God miraculously altered their sense of hearing, why is this miracle not described explicitly in the text? Anyone who explains the text by means of a miracle that is not written explicitly and not part of tradition is giving an explanation that is not true.
All right, sink in. If someone just tells you it's a miracle, and there's no proof in the text that a miracle happened, nowhere in the text does it say, and God fiddled with their eardrums. Nowhere in the text does it say God changed how sound worked for this moment. If nowhere in the text does it say that a miracle occurred, you don't get to invent a miracle just to make your version of the staging fit. Right? And you can't claim the pious high horse by saying, well, I've made another miracle for God, so that must be good. It's like, no, being true to the text trumps inventing new miracles. God doesn't want you to invent new miracles. God wants you to understand the text. And even if you can't understand the text, your solution should not be invent miracles to cover up for your misunderstanding. That's not helping God. Okay, so, and he has to answer one big problem, which is, but it kind of sort of happens in the Talmud.
Yeah, that's fine. Even if we should find such things in the Talmud, if they are the words of a single individual, we should neither accept nor deny them.
All right, so he takes a very diplomatic route, which is every now and then you see rabbis that say all sorts of things that don't really seem to fit in the text and don't claim for having an enlightened tradition that this is, in fact, something that's been handed down as being this is what occurred. And he says, well, you know, those are the sages of the Talmud, and they often have access to information we don't, and maybe they didn't put the footnotes in that we would have liked, but we don't have to say they were right because they're not giving the proof. We also just shouldn't say they're wrong or stupid because they are the sages of the Talmud. So we sort of set those on the shelf and say that's very nice, but we still have to understand it without that benefit of that idea, because that idea is not proven by the text or proven by the argument or proven by a firm tradition. It's a fairly radical statement to say, show me in the text where this happens. Now, it may be a stretch, and many of us in other lessons, we have wrestled over how far the text can be stretched to be made to said such and such is happening or it happened in such and such a way. That's okay, right? It doesn't mean that the text has to be agreed upon perfectly for everyone before it can be accepted by someone. But it does have to have some linkage to what's actually occurring. You don't get to just invent stuff because it makes you happy. Yes? No? Okay. So Rambam's going to weigh in again. But we're not going to end with Rambam because we're going to see people argue with him. And this is part of what Ibn Ezra was talking about. Rambam's going to give his presentation of what he thought really, really happened. And then he's going to get smacked by someone who says, you're not proving that. And therefore, I don't have to accept it. Even from Rambam, I don't have to accept it if you don't prove it.
It is clear to me that what Moses experienced at the revelation on Mount Sinai was different from that which was experienced by all the other Israelites. For Moses alone was addressed by God. And for this reason, the second person singular is used in the Ten Commandments.
All right, so if you go back and you remember from your Hebrew classes, and you look through the verses of the Ten Commandments, you will see that over and over again, it is addressing you. Now in Hebrew, there are two different versions of the pronoun you. There is a singular you and there is a plural you. So if I want to talk to one person and say, hey you, I use one word. And if I want to talk to a group of people and say, hey you, I use a different word. Right? The English equivalent is of course you and y'all. Right? That's the English equivalent to the Hebrew. That's the closest we can get. Although I heard that y'all can be singular and all y'all is the plural. But I'm not an expert in that dialect of English. What? Use. I'm not an expert in that version either. So, but that's the basic idea. We got singular, we got plural, and if you look at the Ten Commandments, they are in the singular. And Rambam is basing his analysis on that. He says, because it's all in the singular, God must have been talking to a singular person. And who is the most singular of singular that God could be talking to? Moses. Which means Moses experienced all of the detail we're seeing here in the text, and the people didn't. Right? The people experienced, like we saw in that last paragraph in chapter 20, the thunder, the lightning, the horn, the blast, the trembling, and all of that, but they didn't get the words. But he still has this Talmudic tradition about the first two being different. And see what he does with those.
For these two principles, the existence of God and his unity,
Right? Those are what he is taking to be commandment 1 and commandment 2. The having no other gods, he's reversing into the philosophical statement of God's unity and oneness.
can be arrived at by means of reasoning, and whatever can be established by proof is known by the prophet in the same way as by any other person. He has no advantage in this respect. But the rest of the commandments are of an ethical and authoritative character and do not contain truths perceived by the intellect.
All right.
Right.
The first two commandments you could have gotten at whether you were standing at Sinai or not, is what Rambam just said. If you thought about it properly and long enough, everyone would know God exists and God is one. That's Rambam's assertion here. So those first two statements, when Moses comes back to the people and says, this is what God has told me, they went, well, yeah, duh. We could have figured that out on our own. And therefore, they don't get preferential treatment when it comes to the authoritativeness for them. They are something that is authoritative by virtue of us being humans who have a reasoning capacity that God gave us. The other ones, the ethical and the other authoritative commandments that talk about Shabbat and not murdering and all of that, those come because God has revealed them through Moses. But these first two, you could have come to on your own. So, yeah.
But how many of the average, how many average people, persons, go that much into depth to try to figure it out?
So that's a big problem. So Rambam's hypothetical is anybody who thought long enough and right enough would come to these conclusions is predicated on the idea that someone might think at all, or think properly, or think long enough. And given the history of the world, and especially the prevalence of idolatry in those days, it doesn't seem like a lot of people were doing that. In fact, as far as we know, the one person who in all of the Torah did that all on their own is called Abraham. And he is also a rather singular individual. You don't see just flocks and flocks of people around the world all arriving at these two conclusions that Rambam says are so obvious that you didn't even need to declare them at Mount Sinai. And that's a little bit of a challenge to what he says. Now, it's nice that he believes we all have that capacity, but maybe we all did actually need a boost through revelation because rationalization wasn't taking us there.
But God reached out to Abraham also.
Well, if you read the text carefully, Abraham seems to be selected after the fact, as though something has already happened that makes God connect to him.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why we have so many midrashim about Abraham as a young man smashing the idols and challenging Nimrod and all of that, because our sages realized Abraham comes out of nowhere all on his own. And then it's God is giving this covenant to him. It's not that God said, here I am, let me teach you. Okay, now that you're doing well, let's give you a covenant. It's almost as though Abraham just spontaneously appears on the scene, fully formed and connected.
He earns his right.
And he earns it almost independently.
Yeah.
And that's stunning and unprecedented. And that's why Rambam's statement here that everyone could do it is kind of a little, well, gee, I'm glad you all think we're capable of that, but I personally am quite glad I was raised with Torah and didn't have to come up on this with my own, because I look at the billions of people who have lived throughout human history, and a big number of them don't come up with this idea on their own unless someone first gives that idea to them.
But the children of Israel had a year to observe the plagues and all that went on during that period of time, plus the Exodus itself, plus the splitting of the sea.
Right?
So they had to know something was going on.
But they already had a pretty big leg up, exactly.
As to whether it was one God.
Apparently they were still a bit ambiguous on that.
Yeah.
Yes.
They had, built a fire.
Yeah.
Yes, but they were always moaning and never felt secure. So I mean, they
So
saw
they
more
had
miracles
some
than
education.
any generation.
All right, well, let's see the way where Rambam goes with this, and then why Shadal is going to say,
The Israelites heard on that occasion a certain sound which Moses understood to proclaim the first 2 commandments, and through Moses, all other Israelites learned them when he, in intelligible sounds, repeated them to the people.
All right, so he's saying these 2 principles are special because they are uniquely known by reason. But even if you didn't, at the mountain, the people did hear-ish the presence of God, sort of like what you were saying, Ria, that they kind of were aware of God and what was happening, but they couldn't put it into words. They didn't understand it really enough to make it intelligible. That was Moses's job, right? It's the rest of us were just hearing the and Moses was picking out the actual meaning of that in a way that could be expressed in words, what we call the Torah. So they experienced, but they didn't get the words. They got the feeling of what was happening, of what God was, but they didn't get the details because they weren't prepared for the details. It took a Moses to get the details. How are we looking at that? Yeah, right. They heard a thunderous cloud and blowing horn, and Moses said, that horn means on Shabbat, this is what we do. And your parents, this is how you treat them. And murder, this is what you don't do. Okay, well, let's keep going.
Know this and remember it, that it is impossible for any person to expound the revelation on Mount Sinai more fully than our sages have done, since it is one of the secrets of the Torah. It is very difficult to have a true conception of the revelation and what occurred in it, for there has never been before, nor will there ever be again, anything like it. Know this.
All right, so when he starts with a know this and finishes with a know this, that's Rambam writing in all caps, if such a thing existed in the Arabic that he wrote in. He's basically saying, ultimately, this is a very deep mystery that we have hints of from the writings of the sages in Midrash and Talmud, but it's impossible to truly understand and explicate it. And for Rambam to say something is beyond the reach of what can be explained and shared is a major statement, because he sort of made a career out of explaining and sharing. So he's putting a sort of a break on how far you may think we can go. And CCB DeMille may have thought he could put together a great stage production of this, but Rambam is ultimately saying it's a wonderful metaphor. But don't think you're getting close to the truth. Shadal, on the other hand, is not taken by this.
I will make no conclusion as to what Maimonides' rationale was in this exalted matter.
And that's, by the way, 18th or 19th century talk for I don't know what he was thinking.
For it is exceedingly difficult to penetrate its mystery.
He was smoking something when he wrote that.
Blessed be the omnipresent, who has freed us from that philosophy which prevailed in Maimonides' days, toward which he tended more than he should have, even if his intention was for the good.
So Shadal is basically saying, Rambam, I understand you lived at this time, Aristotelian philosophy and the conversations with the Muslim philosophers in your day. And I know that was what people were asking about and what you thought you needed to explain in a way that could keep the learned among the faithful of Israel. But you just went too far. Making this too hyper-rational intellect coming to this conclusion. No, it was Sinai, okay? It was Sinai, and we heard something. We experienced more than a vague shadow of a sound that then Moses, with his rarefied, command of the active intellect, was, no, says Shadal. I understand why you did it kind of, sort of, because of your day and age. But let's get to what I think, based on a lot of other rabbis, actually happened. So the final text here is from Shadal.
The correct opinion is that of the rabbis in Midrash Hazita, Shia Hashri, on the verse, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, and that's from Psalms, and of Ibn Ezra and of Ravanel, that all of the 10 commandments were said by God in the hearing of the entire congregation of Israel. That is, God miraculously caused a voice to be heard in the air as if a human being were producing those words. From I am until anything belonging to your neighbor.
Which is the bookends of the 10 Commandments, right? It starts off with the first word of the 10 Commandments and goes to the end of the 10 Commandments. And he is going unambiguous here and saying, God made a sound in the air. Didn't put it in people's brains. It wasn't just a feeling. This wasn't a sensation. This was air molecules vibrating, creating sound waves that would be heard by anyone who was standing there. And this is attempting to get over the big issue of, well, how did the ideas get conveyed? And he's saying, no, it got conveyed in the simplest, most direct means possible, so that all of the people would understand it unambiguously. That there would not be any questions and anything else. Because after all, as we said at the very beginning, the whole point of the revelation at Sinai was so that the people would believe forever. And as all of us know, emotions and feelings, those can fade with time. Right? I sort of thought I had a magical moment when I was at Mount Sinai, but then I got back to work, you know, doing the sheep and my crops and building a fire for the evening. And that experience fades. I'm sure all of us have had those moments of deep, profound spirituality, whether it be at the birth of a child and natural grandeur, a major trauma in life, something happening that they just felt was changing them forever. And 6 months later, it was life as usual. And he's basically saying, but you couldn't ignore what you actually heard. No one could doubt, well, did I really feel that? Was it really that bad? No, you heard the voice coming out of this experience. That's what made Sinai so different than everything before or after. He's really trying to preserve its uniqueness in the annals of human history.
And what he's saying is these verses, the verse I'm going to read, prove that point.
Right. So he's saying, remember we said before from Ibn Ezra, if you want to prove that something's happening, show me the verse. Show me how it's proven in the text.
Then God uttered all these words. You have seen that from the heaven I spoke with you, and the Lord spoke with them from the midst of the fire. He declared to them his pact, the 10 utterances.
Right, and there's more verses in his commentary as well, which I didn't have room on the page, I'm sorry. But he goes through a number of verses that explain, that are quite explicit. These are perhaps the most explicit, where it says, I told you 10 things, right? I spoke to you all of this. And he says, God spoke to us all of this. And you don't need to come up with a philosophical, you know, exciting explanation for an alternative way that this can happen other than air molecules. No, for this, let's accept it happened as it sounds.
There is no hint in scripture to what was said in the Talmud, that only 1 and 2 were heard directly from the mouth of the Almighty. Excuse
Bless
me.
you.
Without
I thought that was a dramatic
That was
pause.
very dramatic, yes. And my mother would say, skin sneezed it up, which means if you sneeze on something, a statement, that makes it true.
These on the truth, yep.
Without a doubt, the rabbis did not receive this idea by way of tradition. Rather, there were conflicting homiletical statements as to this matter.
All right, so Shadal has to answer the question, much like Ibn Ezra raised for us. But what about in the Talmud where it said that there were only 2 that were heard? And he's like, yeah, that was one guy. Right, that was one guy, and that was what he.
What a guy.
And what a guy! And it is a powerful teaching of the idea that these 2 are special and that they stand above the others and all of that. And that is a very important idea of how we conceive of our faith as being rooted first and foremost in an understanding of God's existence and God's oneness. And that's fine, but that's called a homily. That's called a drash, right? That's called a sermon. And just because it works well for a sermon doesn't mean that's how it actually happened. Right? And that's something that I know can sometimes be confusing, is that we will have many different teachings that sound like they are trying to tell us this is how it actually happened. But what Shadal is saying here, and many other sages besides, is not all of them are making a claim about what actually happened. Or even if they are, they may just be the opinion of one guy of what actually happened. And we don't have to accept every opinion of every single voice that's telling us what. We should try to glean from it why they were saying it and what was the meaning.
No, I was just going to say how incredibly remarkable it is that we have kept the concept of an entire people having a theophany. Men, women, children, everyone equal.
Jew and non-Jew.
Jew and non-Jew.
I remember there was a mixed multitude that came out with
of
us.
Egypt. And it would have been so easy to set that priesthood and Moses in there to separate us It's really quite remarkable.
The act of Sinai is one of the most profound parts of Judaism as a whole, and one of the most profound acts in all of human history. And ultimately, as Rambam sort of put it, we may never know exactly what it looked like and what it sounded like. But that shouldn't stop us from just being in awe that it happened. In any one of these varieties, it doesn't lose its magnificence and its importance. And ultimately that, I hope, is something that you can walk away from here today. And when we read the 10 Commandments coming on Shabbat, that when you stand to hear them, you won't worry about exactly what it looked like,
Right.
but you will worry about, what does this mean? What does it mean that I can still hear the voice of God 3,000 years later?
I'm just curious as to why it's so important for us to try to know how we heard God's word, but isn't what's most important the words themselves?
And your answer, or your question, answers itself, which is the words themselves describe how we heard what God said, right? The Torah describes the Torah's giving. And therefore, to understand the Torah, you have to understand even those passages that try to tell you how the Torah was given, right? So we can't say, oh, well, that's interesting, but I'm going to move on to the good stuff of don't murder and keep Shabbat and honor your parents. We have to understand even the complicated things that may have no practical import. They're not actually going to change how we do a mitzvah, but they can, by our study, change how we approach the other words as well. And hopefully that's why, even though we're not going to make a movie of this, what we studied today is still worthwhile.
And what amazes me, the fact that our scholars can argue
Oh, yes.
about it,
Oh, that's
and
so hard.
debate
Mhm.
it, and argue, and that's okay.
Not just okay, it's required.
Yes.
You have to argue about
I
it.
think that has made, has made our religion last.
Yes, it is made.
Because you can question, you can debate, and that's okay.
It's
Instead
made
of being
all the difference.
told You have to have faith.
Correct. In fact,
Is you can discuss it, you can argue it, and that's wonderful.
for those of you who missed the nutshell 2 weeks ago on Salome Alexandra, the last ruler of the independent Judean state, my friend Jason, who works with me to do YouTube videos, we've just put that up online. So you can see a half-an-hour version that also talks about that. And that's exactly one of the points I made, is that under her reign, we really set in motion the idea that no one sect would have enforcement ability to crush alternative beliefs. And that has made all the difference, indeed. All right.
That's why girls, the last, what is it, from Alexandra, Salome to